From the fjords of Norway to the beaches of France, a line of concrete and steel stretched across the edge of Europe, the Atlantic Wall. It was Hitler's boast, his promise that no army would ever breach Fortress Europe. Thousands of bunkers were poured by hand, millions of mines buried beneath the sand. Cannons were aimed toward a sea that never slept. German engineers, slave laborers, and soldiers worked day and night, turning coastlines into killing grounds. Every inch was measured for death, every approach calculated for annihilation. If the Allies came, they would face a wall of iron and fire. Hitler called it impenetrable. His generals believed it unstoppable. But behind the illusion of strength lay the seeds of overconfidence and the quiet beginning of a plan that would break it forever.
To the Nazi high command, Europe was sealed. Every coastline bristled with guns, every harbor mined, every sky watched. The Wehrmacht called it Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, a continent encased in concrete and confidence. German propaganda showed soldiers relaxing in seaside bunkers, laughing, certain that no invasion could ever reach them. Hitler's generals trusted in distance, in weather, in the raw power of geography. They believed the English Channel was their greatest ally, a moat no army could cross under fire. But what they didn't know was that across that very water, an army was gathering, silent, unseen, and unstoppable. While Germany built walls, the Allies built a storm.
Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was no ordinary commander. He had seen how swiftly tides of war could turn, and he feared one thing above all: an Allied landing on the French coast. When Hitler ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, Rommel saw the flaws immediately. He knew that fortresses alone couldn't stop an invasion, not when the enemy ruled the skies. So Rommel brought his desert tactics to Europe. He turned beaches into minefields, filled dunes with tank traps, and scattered thousands of steel obstacles known as Rommel's asparagus. He even ordered artillery to be hidden inside the cliffs themselves. His goal was brutal and simple: crush the invasion on the beaches before it could breathe. If the Allies established a foothold, he warned, Germany was finished. But as Rommel built his wall of sand and steel, the enemy was building something far greater. A deception so perfect, he would never see the real invasion coming.
Spring 1944. Across the French coast, a strange stillness hung in the air. German patrols walked the beaches, eyes scanning the horizon, the rhythmic crash of waves masking an unease they couldn't name. The Atlantic Wall stretched for thousands of miles, concrete, wire, and steel, a monument to Hitler's paranoia and Rommel's precision. Yet deep down, the men stationed there knew something was coming. Across the Channel, England was a fortress of its own, but alive. Ports were packed with landing craft, airfields swarmed with bombers and paratroopers, and secret camps buzzed with coded whispers. Soldiers wrote letters home, priests prayed with men who would never return, and generals waited for a single word: go. The sea was calm, the wind quiet. Even the gulls seemed to circle slower that week. Then, in the early hours of June 6th, the silence would be shattered, and the horizon would turn black.
Before a single soldier set foot on Normandy's beaches, the Allies were already fighting, not with bullets, but with illusions. Across southern England, entire divisions seemed to appear overnight. Tanks made of rubber, trucks built from wood, and airfields bustling with fake aircraft painted on canvas. From the air, German reconnaissance reported massive troop movements, but none of it was real. This was Operation Fortitude, one of the greatest deceptions in military history. Its goal, to convince Hitler that the invasion would strike at Calais, not Normandy. Even the commanders were part of the ruse. General George S. Patton, feared by the Germans, was placed in charge of the 1st U.S. Army Group, an army that existed only on paper and in photographs. Radio operators sent fake transmissions. Inflatable tanks were moved at night to suggest mobilization. Sound engineers blasted recordings of machinery to complete the illusion. And it worked. When the real invasion began in Normandy, German divisions waited days for an attack that never came, guarding Calais against an army of ghosts. The ghosts of deception had done their job, and they helped open the gates of Europe.
Before D-Day could succeed, the Allies knew they had to win a different kind of war, one of shadows, whispers, and absolute deceit. This was Operation Bodyguard, the master plan to mislead the entire German high command. Its purpose was simple and terrifyingly ambitious: make Hitler believe the invasion could come anywhere but Normandy. Bodyguard wasn't just one operation. It was a web of lies. From fake troop buildups to double agents feeding false intelligence, from phantom radio chatter to deceptive bombing patterns, every move was designed to sell the illusion. British double agents like Garbo sent hundreds of believable reports to Berlin, so convincing that Hitler trusted them more than his own generals. Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable used radar-reflecting chaff dropped by aircraft to simulate entire fleets heading for Calais. Meanwhile, real soldiers and ships crept toward Normandy in silence. On June 6, 1944, as the horizon turned black with Allied ships, German commanders still believed it was a diversion. They waited for the real invasion that never came, and that hesitation sealed their fate. Operation Bodyguard was more than deception. It was a symphony of lies so perfect it changed the course of the war.
If Operation Bodyguard was the grand illusion, then its actors were the double agents, men and women who risked everything to feed Hitler exactly what he wanted to hear. Foremost among them was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. A Spanish nobody turned master deceiver, Garbo built an entire imaginary spy network, 27 fake agents who never existed, each sending reports so detailed that German intelligence believed every word. They paid him handsomely, never realizing he worked for Britain. While Garbo spun stories, the Allies created phantom divisions to back them up. Entire armies made of rubber tanks, wooden planes, and empty tents filled the English countryside. From the air, it looked like an unstoppable invasion force. The 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly led by General George S. Patton himself. Radio operators sent out streams of fake transmissions. Actors posed as officers in pubs. Even fake orderlies delivered paperwork stamped top secret. To the Germans watching across the channel, it all looked real. By the time Allied troops actually sailed for Normandy, the illusion had taken hold so completely that Hitler was convinced the real attack would come at Pas de Calais. The double agents had done the impossible. They'd made ghosts fight a war and win.
The fate of the free world balanced on something no general could command: the weather. In early June 1944, the Allied invasion fleet, the greatest armada in human history, waited silently in British ports. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, and an entire continent's hope stood ready to cross the channel. But nature refused to cooperate. A fierce Atlantic storm swept across the northern seas,
churning the waves into chaos. Winds screamed, clouds thickened, and visibility vanished. The invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, was set for June 5th, but with waves towering and skies raging, it seemed impossible. Hitler's meteorologists saw the same storm. They predicted it would last for days, and so did Rommel, who took the opportunity to travel home to Germany. He thought the invasion was weeks away. But hidden in a small English command center, a team of Allied weather forecasters saw something others didn't. A narrow break in the storm, a brief calm that would open on June 6th. For just 24 hours, the wind would die, the seas would settle, and the clouds would lift. Eisenhower had to decide, delay again or risk everything. Silence filled the room. Every commander waited for his word. Finally, Eisenhower turned and said simply, "Okay, let's go." And with that, history shifted. The storm still raged behind them, but through that tiny window of calm, the greatest invasion the world had ever seen began to move.
The night before D-Day was unlike any other in history. Across southern England, towns, airfields, and harbors pulsed with quiet tension, an entire army holding its breath. Tens of thousands of soldiers sat in their camps, rain pattering on canvas, letters half-written in trembling hands. Some prayed, some smoked in silence. Others stared into the dark, replaying training drills they'd done 1,000 times, knowing that in hours it would all be real. In the airfields, paratroopers painted black streaks under their eyes and checked their gear for the last time. Inside the barracks, the sound of engines warming up echoed like thunder in the distance. On the ships, sailors stood by their rails, watching lightning dance far out over the channel. Many still believed the invasion might be canceled. The weather was brutal, cold winds, churning seas, and the sky offered no hint of dawn. But then, just before midnight, word spread through the ranks: "We're going." In that moment, the air changed. Men who had waited for years to take Europe back from tyranny realized that this was it. There would be no more delays, no more drills, no more wondering when. Some tucked family photos into their helmets. Others whispered jokes, pretending not to be afraid. And as the order came to board, the night filled with the rumble of engines, trucks, ships, and planes, all moving toward destiny. June 5th became the longest night of their lives, and when the first light touched the channel, the horizon would never look the same again.
At dawn, the sea was alive. The gray waters of the English Channel, once calm under the receding storm, now churned beneath the weight of the largest invasion fleet ever assembled, more than 5,000 ships, stretching from horizon to horizon. From every direction, destroyers, landing craft, and transport vessels formed an endless, moving wall of steel. For the men on the beaches of France, it looked like the world itself was coming for them. As the mist began to lift, the German sentries at Normandy rubbed their eyes in disbelief. What they saw was not an army. It was an ocean of men, ships, and fire. They called in frantic reports. "The sea, it's full of ships, the entire sea!" The horizon turned black with silhouettes. Battleships pounding the coast with thunder, rockets streaking through the dawn, and wave after wave of landing craft charging toward the shore. In the skies above, the roar was deafening. More than 11,000 aircraft filled the air. Fighters, bombers, gliders. The sky itself seemed to tremble. Inside the landing craft, soldiers crouched shoulder to shoulder, the smell of salt, oil, and fear thick around them. Engines roared, waves crashed. Some whispered prayers, others gripped their rifles tighter. Ahead of them, the beaches of Normandy waited. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword. Names that would soon be written into eternity. When the ramps dropped, the world erupted. Machine guns tore through the surf. Shells fell like rain. The horizon had gone black not only with ships, but with smoke, fire, and sacrifice. And yet, through the chaos, they moved forward. Step by step, wave after wave, turning the impossible into history.
Before the beaches even saw a single landing craft, the night sky over France had already come alive. Just after midnight on June 6, 1944, the rumble of thousands of engines rolled across the dark. C-47 transport planes flew in formation, black shadows against a moonlit sky, each carrying men who would be the first to step into occupied Europe. Inside those planes sat the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, American paratroopers weighed down with gear, faces painted in charcoal, hearts pounding in the dark. They joked, they prayed, they checked their lines again and again. Many knew they might not even live to see sunrise. Then came the signal, the green light. One by one, they leapt into the void. The cold wind hit, the roar of engines faded, and the night exploded with motion. Thousands of parachutes blossomed in the moonlight, white, gray, and camouflaged, drifting silently down over fields, hedgerows, and villages. To the German troops below, it looked as if the sky itself was falling. Tracer fire clawed upward, searchlights cut through the clouds, and chaos spread as paratroopers landed scattered miles apart. Some drowned in flooded fields, some were captured before they could even fire a shot. But others regrouped in the dark, rallied whoever they could find, and began fighting, not as divisions, but as brothers. By dawn, bridges had been seized, roads cut, and German reinforcements thrown into confusion. The men who had dropped from the sky had already cracked open Hitler's fortress Europe. Above them, parachutes still drifted down like ghosts, silent reminders that before the invasion fleet ever arrived, America's first soldiers had already taken the fight to the ground.
At 6:30 a.m., as the first Allied landing craft scraped against the sand of Normandy, the radios inside German bunkers began to explode with noise. Frantic voices shouted over static, "Landung! Landung! They're landing!" The impossible was happening. For years, the German High Command had boasted that no army could cross the Channel. Now that myth was dissolving in gunfire and smoke. Along the coast, bunker doors slammed open. Soldiers scrambled to their machine guns, their commanders shouting orders that no one could hear over the thunder of naval guns. Everywhere, communication lines went dead, cables severed by bombardment, radios jammed, officers isolated. At first, many German units believed this was a diversion, a feint to draw them away from Calais. Even Hitler himself refused to believe the real invasion had begun. He slept through the first hours of D-Day, his generals too terrified to wake him with the truth. Meanwhile, on the beaches below, Allied troops poured out of their landing craft. Mortars fell, machine guns spat fire from pillboxes, and through binoculars, German officers watched in disbelief. The sea was full of ships, the sky full of planes, and the horizon alive with men who just kept coming. Panic rippled through the bunkers. Some commanders ordered retreats that never reached their troops.
Others fought to the last bullet, trapped in concrete tombs. To those inside the Atlantic Wall, it felt like the very edge of the world was collapsing. The invasion they said would never come had arrived with a vengeance. By the time Hitler finally woke, the beaches of Normandy were already on fire, and the fate of Europe had begun to turn.
The men who landed at Omaha Beach stepped straight into hell. It was 6:31 a.m. when the ramps dropped and the cold surf of the channel rushed in. But before a single soldier could reach the shore, the world erupted. German MG-42 machine guns screamed from the cliffs, cutting through the air like tearing fabric. Mortars rained down, shells burst among the landing craft, and men vanished beneath the waves before they ever touched land. The tide was rising fast, swallowing equipment, bodies, and hope. Flames danced on the surface of the water as oil from destroyed landing craft caught fire. The wounded clung to floating debris, watching as the next wave charged forward. The American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions had trained for this, but nothing could prepare them for the wall of death waiting above. The beach offered no cover. Every inch of sand was zeroed in by German guns, hidden in concrete bunkers and dugouts. Officers fell, radios were destroyed, units shattered. For a time, it looked as if Omaha might fail, that the invasion itself could die there in the blood-stained surf. But out of the chaos, leadership and courage began to rise. Small groups, sometimes just 5 or 6 men, crawled forward, blowing gaps through the wire with Bangalore torpedoes, climbing cliffs slick with blood and seawater, fighting bunker by bunker with grenades and flamethrowers. By mid-morning, the smoke was so thick the sun disappeared. The beach that had been a death trap turned into a foothold. The Americans were no longer pinned down, they were climbing up. When the day finally ended, Omaha was theirs. More than 2,000 had fallen, but they had torn open the gate to Fortress Europe. Behind them, the tide carried away the wreckage of war. Ahead of them, the road to Berlin had just begun.
While Omaha burned with fire and fury, 4 more beaches were alive with their own battles for liberation. Each had its own story, its own heroes, and its own price in blood. At Utah Beach, the landing went wrong before it even began. Strong currents pushed the first wave nearly a mile off course, but that mistake saved lives. They came ashore where German defenses were weaker. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., at 56 years old and walking with a cane, looked around, realized they were in the wrong place, and said calmly, "We'll start the war from right here." By noon, the Americans had linked up with the 101st Airborne and pushed inland. Further east, the British and Canadians struck the beaches of Gold, Juno, and Sword. They faced walls of wire, mines, and bunkers, but also fierce determination. At Gold Beach, British engineers cleared paths through obstacles, while tanks fitted with flails beat mines out of the sand. At Juno, Canadian troops landed under murderous fire, their first wave suffering nearly 50% casualties, yet by the end of the day, they had pushed farther inland than anyone else. At Sword Beach, the British stormed ashore alongside French commandos led by Philippe Kiefer, reclaiming their homeland with bayonets and grenades. They captured vital bridges, linked up with airborne troops, and secured the flank closest to Kane. Across all 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, 156,000 Allied soldiers fought their way onto European soil in a single day. 5 gates had opened, 5 wounds torn in Hitler's fortress, 5 names that would forever stand for freedom. By nightfall on June 6, 1944,
Europe was no longer sealed in darkness. The tide of war had turned, and it had the footprints of men who refused to turn back.
They weren't superheroes. They weren't unbreakable. They were ordinary men who stepped off boats and into history, knowing that the next breath could be their last. On D-Day, the soldiers of the Allied invasion faced something beyond fear. They faced the full power of an empire determined to hold its ground. The cliffs were alive with machine guns, the sand alive with explosions, and the air thick with smoke, fire, and the cries of the wounded. Some never made it past the surf. Some drowned under the weight of their packs before their boots touched the beach. Others charged forward through the chaos, dragging the wounded, shouting orders through the roar of gunfire, their courage louder than the storm around them. There was no cover, no retreat, only forward. Corpsmen sprinted through open fire to pull men from the water. Engineers hacked through barbed wire with bare hands. Medics built makeshift hospitals behind dunes that were still being shelled. And when officers fell, privates took command without hesitation. One soldier wrote later, "Hell was everywhere, but so was brotherhood." For those who survived, the beach would haunt them forever. They had seen men become legends in a single heartbeat. They had watched friends fall and still kept moving forward. These were the men who walked into hell, not because they wanted to die, but because they believed some things were worth dying for. And when the guns fell silent that night, Europe had begun to breathe again, because they had the courage to walk through fire for freedom.
Long before the first soldier set foot on Normandy's sand, the battle had already begun, from the sea. In the cold gray light before dawn, the Allied fleet unleashed a storm of steel and fire unlike anything the world had ever seen. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, more than 1,200 of them, lined up across the horizon like a wall of vengeance. At 5:30 a.m., the order went out, "Open fire." A moment later, the sea itself seemed to erupt. The thunder of the guns rolled across the channel, echoing for miles as shells the size of cars screamed toward the French coast. Entire sections of the Atlantic Wall vanished under clouds of smoke and dust. Concrete bunkers shattered, gun positions disappeared, and for the German soldiers on shore, the world had turned into a furnace. One witness said, "It felt like the end of the world had arrived from the sea." Each warship worked with precision. Destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, firing point blank at enemy strongholds that refused to fall. Some ships were so near the beach that they scraped the sand beneath their hulls just to silence a single gun that was tearing men apart. When landing craft filled with troops began their deadly approach, the Navy didn't stop. It adjusted. Shells fell just ahead of the waves of men, cutting paths through barbed wire, mines, and defenses. Every blast, every concussion, every plume of smoke was part of a single terrible symphony, the sound of a continent being freed. By the end of the day, the sailors who had never stepped onto the beach had still fought for it with everything they had. Their guns had been the first to speak on D-Day, and without their thunder, the men on the sand might never have survived.
When the first waves of soldiers hit Normandy, the beach wasn't a place, it was chaos. Barbed wire, steel obstacles, landmines, and burning wrecks littered every inch of sand. The air was thick with smoke, gunfire, and the screams of the wounded. And yet, in the middle of it all, another army went to work, armed not with rifles, but with shovels, explosives, bulldozers, and raw courage. They were the combat engineers, the men who turned hell
into a highway. While German guns still roared from the cliffs, engineers sprinted across open sand with satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes, blowing paths through wire and mines for the next wave to advance. Each explosion carved out a few more precious feet of progress. Each man who fell was replaced by another who picked up his tools and kept going. On the water's edge, engineers unloaded bulldozers from landing craft, some sinking before they even touched ground. Those that made it tore through wreckage, pushing debris aside to make roads for tanks, trucks, and artillery. Behind them, Navy Seabees and Army engineers worked together to turn the shoreline into a base. They cleared obstacles, built temporary piers out of wrecked vehicles, and laid down steel mats so trucks could roll directly off the ships. Within hours, what had been a deadly strip of sand was becoming a lifeline for the entire invasion force. One officer said, "They didn't just build bridges and roads, they built victory one shovel at a time." By nightfall, while still smoke drifted from the cliffs, bulldozers were grading roads inland, engineers were stringing telephone lines, and fuel lines were being laid under the surf. The engineers didn't just survive D-Day, they built D-Day. Without them, there wouldn't have been a beachhead, no tanks inland, no victory in France.
Before the sun rose over Normandy, the beaches were already a killing ground. Where the landing craft ramps dropped, bullets tore through the air like rain, and before a single beach was secure, thousands of men were already bleeding into the surf. That's when the medics stepped forward. No rifles, no helmets marked with rank, just a red cross on white cloth. A symbol that meant nothing to the machine guns watching from the cliffs. They crawled through sand and shrapnel, dragging wounded men out of the rising tide, patching arteries with trembling hands, and using helmets as makeshift basins for blood and seawater. Some were shot as they worked, others kept working while wounded themselves. A medic's cry, "Medic!" would echo across the chaos. And still they went, crawling, running, stumbling toward the sound. On Omaha Beach, the sand turned red. Every few yards, a small cross of white cloth fluttered over a man kneeling beside another. Morphine, bandages, prayer. That was all they had. A few feet away, tanks burned. Men screamed for their mothers, and the tide came in like a thief, threatening to drown the wounded who couldn't move. They made triage zones behind dunes and burned out vehicles, turning scraps of canvas into stretchers, ration tins into surgical tools. By the end of the day, some medics had treated over 100 men, many under constant fire, with no more morphine left to give. A German soldier later said, "We stopped firing at one man. He was running through the bullets with his arms full of bandages." The medics didn't take ground. They didn't raise flags or fire weapons, but they saved the souls who did. By nightfall, when the guns finally quieted, you could still see the red crosses moving, faint shapes in the moonlight, caring for the living among the dead.
When the first reports came in from Normandy, most German commanders refused to believe them. At 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the Atlantic Wall was alive with gunfire, but in the bunkers and headquarters behind it, disbelief reigned. Berlin was certain this was a diversion, a trick, a feint meant to pull forces away from Calais. The Allies had spent months feeding the Germans false intelligence, fake radio chatter, phantom divisions, even inflatable tanks across the channel, and it worked. Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, wasn't even at the front. He was hundreds of miles away in Germany, visiting his wife for her birthday, because he too believed the storm wouldn't come yet. At first, the reports from the coast sounded impossible. Parachutes, hundreds of them. Ships, thousands on the horizon. They're landing, now! Hitler's high command dismissed it as hysteria. The 15th Army, guarding Calais, stayed in place. The Panzer divisions, the armored fist that could have crushed the invasion, weren't released for hours, waiting for Hitler's personal order. And he was asleep. By the time the order finally came, the beaches were already crawling with Allied tanks, guns, and men. The impossible had become unstoppable. Even as footage and radio transmissions poured in, some German generals clung to denial. They insisted this was still a decoy, that the real invasion was yet to come. For 48 critical hours, confusion ruled the Reich's most important defense line. By the time they realized Normandy was the invasion, it was too late. The sky over France was black with aircraft. The sea was filled with ships, and the beaches were lost. Rommel would later say, "The enemy has achieved the greatest surprise in military history."
In the days before D-Day, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, believed he finally had time to breathe. Weeks of tension, inspections, and warnings about an Allied invasion had worn him thin. He had argued that the enemy would strike during bad weather, not perfect conditions, and the English Channel had turned stormy. So, on June 5, 1944, Rommel drove home to Germany. He wanted to bring his wife a surprise, a pair of new shoes for her birthday. He even promised his staff that he'd be back by the 7th. But as he rested hundreds of miles away, a storm of steel was gathering across the Channel. The Allies had delayed their invasion by just 24 hours due to rough seas, a delay that made Rommel's timing tragically perfect. When the first calls reached German headquarters in the early morning hours of June 6th, Rommel was asleep in his own bed, unaware that the invasion he'd been warning about for months had begun. By the time his staff reached him, the beaches of Normandy were already burning. He raced back to France in his staff car, watching the sky fill with Allied planes, a sight that told him everything before he even arrived. The Atlantic Wall, his great defensive project, was collapsing under the weight of history, and the man who had built it to stop the invasion wasn't there to give the orders that might have slowed it. One officer would later say bitterly, if Rommel had been there that morning, perhaps the sea would have run even redder. But Rommel himself knew the truth when he returned. No man, not even the Desert Fox, could stop the tide that had come for Germany.
In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the most important battle of the 20th century had begun, and Adolf Hitler was asleep. At 3 a.m., reports began flooding German command posts along the French coast. Radar screens were lighting up. Thousands of ships were spotted crossing the Channel. Frantic officers called Berlin, demanding orders. But there was a problem. The Führer's staff refused to wake him. Hitler had given strict instructions. He was never to be disturbed before 9 a.m., especially after taking his heavy sleeping medication. To his aides, even the possibility of invasion was not reason enough to break that rule. Meanwhile, in Normandy, chaos was spreading. Paratroopers had landed behind the lines, communication cables were cut, and coastal batteries were being overrun. Field commanders pleaded for the release of the Panzer divisions, Germany's best chance to crush the landings before the Allies could dig in. But authorization could only come from Hitler himself. The hours passed. At 6:30 a.m., the first American troops stormed Omaha Beach. At 7:25, British and Canadian forces hit the sands of Gold, Juno, and Sword. By 8 a.m., German officers were shouting into dead phone lines, trying to reach a man who was still dreaming in his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. When Hitler finally awoke, it was already mid-morning. He was told that a major Allied operation was underway, but he didn't believe it. He insisted it was a diversion, that the real invasion would come later at Pas de Calais. The result was paralysis. No reinforcements moved, no counterattack was ordered, and by the time Hitler finally grasped the scale of the assault, it was too late. By then, the beaches were crawling with tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. The tide had turned, both literally and strategically. That morning, Hitler's sleep cost Germany the war's last chance to stop the invasion of Europe.
While Allied soldiers clawed their way up the beaches of Normandy, Germany's deadliest weapons, its armored divisions, sat waiting in the French countryside. The Panzer divisions were the backbone of Hitler's army, feared across Europe for their lightning strikes and unstoppable firepower. But on June 6, 1944, they did not move. Rommel had warned that the invasion must be crushed on the beaches before the Allies could gain a foothold. He argued that the Panzers should be stationed close to the coast, ready to strike the moment the first landing craft appeared. But Hitler and the High Command disagreed. They believed the real invasion would come later at Pas de Calais. So they kept the tanks under direct control of the Führer himself. No one could move them without his personal order. When the invasion began, chaos erupted across German communication lines. Field commanders begged to release the armor. Messages piled up, waiting for approval from Berlin. But Hitler was asleep, and his generals were terrified to act without him. By the time he finally gave permission, the beaches were already secured. The Allies had air superiority, and the Panzers had to drive under constant bombardment from fighter bombers above. Columns of tanks crawled along narrow Norman roads, their engines roaring, their crews frustrated, as Allied planes circled overhead like vultures. Every movement was met with rockets, strafing fire, and explosions from the sky. The once feared Panzer divisions were torn apart before they ever reached the front. By dusk, it was over. The greatest armored counterattack in German history had never truly begun. On that day, the Panzers didn't lose the battle. They were never allowed to fight it. The invasion had succeeded, and the German war machine had been stopped not by the enemy, but by its own command.
By dawn on D-Day, the outcome of the invasion didn't just depend on the men storming the beaches. It depended on who controlled the sky above them. And in June 1944, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. For months before the invasion, Allied air forces had waged a relentless campaign over Europe. They bombed railways, fuel depots, and bridges. They crippled Germany's ability to move men and machines. Every road to Normandy had been burned and broken before a single soldier landed. When D-Day came, more than 11,000 Allied aircraft filled the skies: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, and gliders. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could barely field a few hundred. Many German airfields were already in ruins, and fuel shortages kept their remaining planes grounded. As the invasion unfolded, Allied pilots ruled the air with absolute dominance. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and Spitfires hunted anything that moved behind enemy lines. Tanks, trucks, trains, nothing escaped their wrath. German reinforcements trying to reach Normandy were ambushed from above, their columns shredded with machine guns and rockets. Even daylight movement became suicide. Soldiers called the skies the Allied artillery because airstrikes rained down faster than any shell. The Luftwaffe's few remaining pilots were brave, but hopelessly outnumbered. Those who tried to intercept were met by swarms of Allied fighters. Most never returned to base. By the evening of June 6th, the message was clear. The age of German air dominance was over. The sky that once thundered with Messerschmitts and Stukas now roared with American and British engines. And beneath that sky, the greatest invasion in human history was being secured. One beach, one bomb, and one flight at a time. By the time the sun rose high over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the beaches were a nightmare of chaos, courage, and blood. Every foot of sand came at an unimaginable price. The first waves of Allied troops faced a storm of machine gun fire, mortar shells exploding around them, and the cold Atlantic waves stained red. The plan had looked perfect on paper, but in the surf of Omaha, perfection died quickly. Landing craft drifted off course, tanks sank before they reached the shore, and men were forced to crawl forward through water and wire, fighting just to stay alive. Each patch of beach, each dune, each seawall, each pillbox was paid for in human lives. Medics worked under constant fire, dragging the wounded behind broken obstacles. Officers were killed before giving their first orders. Radio men fell and communication vanished in the roar of battle, but still they advanced. The British pushed through Gold and Sword. The Canadians took Juno after hours of brutal resistance. And at Omaha, where the sea seemed to eat men whole, American soldiers clawed their way off the sand, using sheer will and fury to break through the German defenses. By the afternoon, the beaches were littered with wreckage, twisted steel, burning tanks, and the fallen. But behind that devastation, the impossible had been done. The Allies had a foothold in Fortress Europe. The cost was staggering. Thousands dead or wounded before the first hedgerow was even reached. But every inch of that coastline, every grain of blood-soaked sand, was a victory paid in courage. That day, the world saw the true price of freedom and the men who were willing to pay it. Before June 6, 1944, Nazi Germany still believed victory was possible. The Eastern Front was brutal, but the Wehrmacht held vast territory. The Western Front was quiet, and Hitler's generals still thought they could hold the line. Then came D-Day. What began as a single invasion became the moment the war's balance shifted forever. The Allies had done what the Germans thought impossible: crossed the English Channel, breached the Atlantic Wall, and planted an army on the soil of occupied France. In the days that followed, the beaches became fortresses of their own. Endless streams of men, tanks, ammunition, and supplies poured ashore. Within a week, the Allies had landed more than 325,000 troops. Within a month, over 1 million. German counterattacks tried to throw them back into the sea, but every attempt met the same fate: obliteration by Allied artillery and air power. The tide had turned, and there was no turning it back. In Berlin, the realization began to sink in. For years, Hitler had believed that his empire was unbreakable, that Europe would remain under the shadow of the swastika for 1,000 years. But in the ruins of Normandy, that illusion died. The Western Front was open. The Allies were advancing toward Paris, and from the east, the Red Army was already pushing toward Poland. The Reich was being crushed from both sides, squeezed by two unstoppable forces, one born from the factories of America and Britain, the other forged in the fires of the Soviet Union. D-Day didn't just open a front. It opened the end of Nazi Germany. The world had changed in a single day, and from that moment on, Europe's liberation was only a matter of time.
Once the beaches of Normandy were secure, the invasion turned into something greater: a liberation. For nearly 4 years, Europe had lived under the iron boot of Nazi occupation. Towns were patrolled by soldiers, families lived in fear, and resistance fighters fought in shadows. But now, the horizon shimmered with a different sound. The rumble of Allied tanks, the hum of aircraft overhead, and the marching boots of men bringing freedom back to a continent that had almost forgotten it. The push inland was slow and brutal. The hedgerows of Normandy, thick, ancient walls of earth and brush, became death traps. Every field was a fortress, every village a battlefield. But inch by inch, the Allies moved forward. As the front advanced, French civilians emerged from hiding. They wept, waved flags, and offered wine, bread, and flowers to the soldiers who had crossed the sea for them. For the first time since 1940, the people of France could breathe free air. Resistance groups came out of the shadows, sabotaging rail lines, cutting communication, and joining the Allied advance. Every victory fueled the next. By mid-July, the Allies had broken through the German lines. Towns fell one after another, Saint-Lô, Caen, Avranches. And beyond them lay the open roads to Paris. The liberation of Europe had begun, not with a single battle, but with the courage of millions. Soldiers, sailors, pilots, and civilians, all moving as one toward the same promise, an end to tyranny. From that summer on, the tide no longer belonged to the Reich. It belonged to freedom.
By the end of June 1944, the German High Command could no longer deny the truth. The war on the Western Front was lost. For years, Nazi generals had trusted in their fortifications, their Panzers, and their discipline. They had crushed Europe under their boots, and even when the Allies began bombing their cities, they believed German steel and German will would endure. But Normandy changed everything. The beaches had held, the Allies were pouring in fresh divisions every day, and the Luftwaffe was gone from the skies. Entire Panzer armies had been reduced to burning wrecks in the hedgerows. Generals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel, men who had once embodied Hitler's military genius, began to see what his Führer could not. The tide of war had irreversibly turned. Von Rundstedt was blunt when asked what should be done. He told Berlin, "Make peace, you fools." Rommel, the Desert Fox, argued that continuing the fight in France was suicide. He urged Hitler to withdraw, to save what was left of the army, but his pleas were dismissed as defeatism. In truth, it wasn't just defeatism, it was realism. Rommel had seen the Allied power firsthand, the endless streams of tanks and trucks, the skies filled with planes, and the relentless precision of a war machine that never slept. Every hour, more ships arrived. Every day, another German division vanished from the map. And as the Allies broke out from Normandy, the once proud generals of the Reich began to whisper the unthinkable, that Germany's defeat was no longer a matter of if, but when. By July, Rommel would be wounded in an air attack. By August, von Rundstedt would be dismissed from command. And by the end of summer, the Allies would be marching toward Paris. The invincible Wehrmacht had met an enemy it couldn't outthink, outrun, or outfight. And the men who had built Hitler's empire were finally admitting what he never could, that the Third Reich was dying.
For every mile gained in Normandy, for every village liberated, and every flag raised over Europe again, there were those who would never see home. The cost of D-Day and the battles that followed was staggering. Over 10,000 Allied casualties on the first day alone. Thousands more in the fields and hedgerows that stretched inland. Each foot of progress came with a name, a face, a letter that would never be answered. They were the young and the fearless, farmers from Iowa, factory workers from Manchester, students from Toronto and Sydney, men who had never seen France before and never would again. Their bodies lay scattered across beaches, buried hastily in the sand as the battle raged on. Graves marked with helmets, rifles, and the whisper of waves. For days, the tide washed over the shores where they fell, a quiet reminder of the price paid for freedom. Medics worked until their hands bled. Priests offered last rites under fire, and friends carried friends to makeshift crosses. There were no heroes' farewells, only duty, and the unspoken promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Today, the cemeteries of Normandy stand as silent cities of white stone, row after row, stretching toward the horizon, each marking a story cut short. They didn't fight for glory or for conquest, but for something simpler, a world without tyranny. They were the bridge between darkness and dawn, the reason Europe could rise again. And though they never came home, their victory did. Their courage still echoes in the wind over those cliffs, in the freedom they helped restore, and in every sunrise that followed June 6, 1944.
For years, the Nazi regime had lived in a dream, a delusion of invincibility, fueled by propaganda, fear, and blind faith in Hitler's vision. They had conquered Europe in months, marched through France in weeks, and crushed armies that once seemed untouchable. To the German people, to their soldiers, it seemed as if nothing could ever reach them, not the enemy, not defeat, not justice. But on June 6, 1944, that illusion shattered. As dawn broke over the French coast, the sky filled with Allied planes, and the sea turned black with ships, more vessels than the world had ever seen in one place. It wasn't a raid, it wasn't a diversion, it was the beginning of the end. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's impenetrable defense, crumbled in a single morning. Bunkers fell, beaches were taken, and from the sand of Normandy, the armies of freedom began marching toward the heart of Germany itself. Across occupied Europe, whispers spread like wildfire. They'd landed. In factories, prisons, and villages, people who had lived in silence for years finally dared to hope. The Reich that promised 1,000 years of domination was cracking after barely 12. Inside Hitler's headquarters, panic replaced arrogance. His generals argued, his orders contradicted, and his empire began to fracture from within. For the first time, they faced the truth that the Reich was not unbreakable and that the world had come to end it. D-Day didn't just open a new front. It opened German eyes to the reality they refused to see, that their war was lost, their destiny rewritten, and their illusion gone forever. From that day on, the question was no longer if Germany would fall, but how soon.
The tide that struck Normandy did not stop at the sand. It rolled forward, through the fields of France, the forests of Belgium, and the ruins of every town that had once trembled under the swastika. The men who survived Omaha, Utah, Juno, Gold, and Sword now carried the war into the heart of Europe. They had seen the impossible and lived through it, and nothing would stop them now. Behind them followed an army of machines and supplies, a river of steel, gasoline, and determination. Every bridge crossed, every hedgerow taken, pushed Hitler's dream further into the dust. Paris rose again. The people wept in the streets as Allied tanks rolled beneath the Eiffel Tower, and the sound of freedom returned, after 4 long years of silence. The world could finally breathe, but the war was far from over. To the east, the Red Army thundered across Poland, a storm of vengeance unleashed. To the west, the Americans, British, and Canadians drove forward relentlessly, meeting resistance at every town, every road, every river. The Reich was collapsing, but it would not go quietly. In the skies above Germany, bombers darkened the daylight. Cities burned as the industrial heart of the Reich was torn apart. And on the ground, German soldiers, tired, broken, and disillusioned, fought not for victory, but for survival. By the winter of 1944, the once unstoppable Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. The Atlantic Wall had fallen, the Luftwaffe were shattered, and Hitler's empire was bleeding out. From the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Berlin, it was not just a march of armies, it was the march of justice, the march of humanity reclaiming its soul. The beginning of the end had come, and with every mile forward, the world moved closer to ending the nightmare.